So, a little while ago, I was talking with my two teenage granddaughters when the subject of travel came up. One of them suggested that a youthful sense of wanderlust is a relatively new thing, spurred on by cheap flights and Instagram posts depicting influencers in paradise. I agreed with her to an extent. It's easy to develop a thirst for adventure when your feed is filled up with videos of people canoeing between tropical islands or hiking up to Machu Picchu. But I also assured her that wanderlust has existed for as long as people have. I know it's a bit cliched to start giving it the back in my day thing, but it's true. In days of yore, people only needed to look at maps or hear tales of far-off lands to want to board a ship and sail into the unknown. And in my youth, the same was true for me too. My grandkids couldn't believe their sweet old Irish granny had gone off to see the world, especially not all alone. But it was true. And while I told them all kinds of stories from my time in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent, there was one I saved till they were a little bit older and were of traveling age themselves, because it was one of the most frightening things that I was ever involved with. I left Dublin in 1971 when I was 19. I got a job in London to save some money for the journey ahead, and then used that time to see Buckingham Palace and Big Ben and all of that stuff. From London, I made my way to Paris, where I managed to get a job in a little Irish bar and did the same thing I did in London for a while before moving on to Spain. And Spain was beautiful. All the food was absolutely out of this world, but my original plan was to head to Italy via the south of France. Yet when I got to the Straits of Gibraltar, looked out across the water and saw Morocco just a few miles away, it was like it was calling to me. I could go to Rome and Greece and see all the places I'd seen and read about in history books, or I could head to a place where the people, the food, the music, and the culture were a complete and utter mystery to me. And when I thought of it like that, my mind was made up for me, and off to Morocco I went. I arrived in Tangier after a rough overnight ferry and an even rougher bus ride. I grew up in Dublin, so I thought that I was familiar with the hustle and bustle of a big city, but Tangier made my home city look like a sleepy little village out in the countryside. The second I stepped off the bus at the big central station, there were fellas all around me and the other passengers offering hotels, taxis, hashish, you name it. I had one guy actually try and grab my bag off of me so he could carry it, and I had to shout and bat him away so he'd leave me alone. I don't think he meant anything by it, because some of the other wannabe helpers started laughing at him and poking fun in Arabic, but it made for one heck of an introduction to Morocco, and the intensity level never really dropped. The old city was like a sensory overload, a maze of tiny white streets with technicolored washing flapping on lines overhead. Then the marketplaces were absolute bedlam. Sacks of colorful spices were everywhere, with piles of oranges and lemons adding to the medley of all of it. There were all kinds of shiny copper trinkets and jewelry, then rugs so intricately stitched that I just had to pick one up on the way home. And the whole thing was soundtracked by endless haggling, which only stopped when the call to prayer rang out, loud and haunting, over flat rooftops. The smells were amazing too. Everywhere smelled like cumin, cinnamon, and ginger, and in certain places I smelled this very strong, fragrant, but almost oily smell that I later found out was burning hashish. Now, I got a taste for the sweet mint tea that they drink over there, and my favorite spots to drink were this Cafe Baba up on the hill and Cafe Hafa right on the cliff edge. And at night, the square came alive with acrobats, snake charmers, and storytellers, and I'd head out for a whole meal of tagine or couscous, which back then cost less than $1. Then when I was too tired to keep my eyes open anymore, I'd head back to the hostel that I checked into on my first day I arrived, and I'd catch some sleep before doing it all again the next day. My hostel consisted of 2 dorms, 1 male, 1 female, with each having space for about 12 mattresses. You got a little footlocker to lock things in, and there were communal showers and toilet facilities too, but that was about it. It was a place to rest your head. Nothing more, nothing less, but some heads needed more rest than others. It tended to be those who mixed booze and hash that suffered the worst hangovers, and it wasn't uncommon for me to have to rise, shower, and dress in silence so as not to disturb some very cranky partiers. One night, I came home really late myself to find someone passed out under a blue sheet. Now, I reckon that they'd probably had a little too much and needed to sleep it off, but in the morning, they were still there, covered from head to toe in that blue sheet. As I said, I was used to being extra quiet in the mornings, and so I completed my morning routine with all the energy of a dormouse and then headed out to do some more exploring. Now, I had another amazing day in Tangier, but I wanted to get some of the Marrakesh too, so after visiting the bus station to inquire about ticket prices, I went back to the hostel to take a shower and a siesta before the evening. But then, when I arrived, I saw 2 police cars outside. I eyed them curiously on my approach, and then as I walked into the hostel, one of the officers shouted something to me in Arabic. And while I couldn't understand exactly what he was saying, I figured it was more or less translated to halt. Now, I turned around in time to see the hostel's owner across the way, and it looked like he was comforting one of the other girls that had been staying in the dorm with me. His English was really good thanks to all the tourists and backpackers who came through, so after excusing himself from the girl, I think she was Dutch, he rushed over to explain what was going on. There was a lot of drug smuggling going on in Tangier at the time, with backpackers just like me bringing hash back home to make some massive profits. And while people smoking hash was somewhat tolerated by police, they did not like smugglers. So you'd hear stories from backpackers and being stopped, searched, and sometimes even arrested if they had a large amount of hash on them and not enough cash to pay the bribe. Now, I thought it was something like that because it was mostly solo backpackers, and I obviously fit that profile. But then instead of asking to look through my things, the police started asking me questions about where I'd been the previous night. The owner of the hostel was doing all the translating, so it was a bit slow going back and forth, but they kept asking where I'd been and what I'd done. But most of all, they wanted to know if I'd had any interactions with one of my dorm mates, a French girl whose name had sadly slipped my mind. Now, I think it was Melina or Selena or maybe even Celine, but whatever it was, they wanted to know if we'd spoken and what was said. I told them I'd hardly said a word to anyone I was staying with, and there were girls from all over Europe passing through and staying on those beds, so I didn't even know who they were referring to in the first place. One of the police officers then asked how I'd slept that previous night. I was confused, so after telling them that I slept just fine, I asked why that mattered. The same officer asked if I'd noticed anything the next morning, anything at all about my dorm room. And that's when it hit me. And when it hit me all at once. I'd been so programmed for privacy that I didn't see the lump under the blue sheet for what it was. How no one could pass out under a sheet in the Moroccan heat for 9 hours without once getting up to pee or even get a drink of water. Not unless they were dead. I started to panic, realizing that not only had I slept all night with a dead body just feet away from me, but I'd casually showered and dressed without even paying the poor girl a second thought. Then on top of all of that, the police thought I'd killed her. Or at least that's what it felt like when they asked to speak to me down at the police station. It led me away to my car. The hostel's owner was nice enough to come down to the station with me to act as translator, and there I saw a handful of other guests, all sitting on plastic seating in what passed for a kind of waiting room. They didn't put us in cells, although I suppose they could have if they wanted to. They just wanted to ask us some questions, so that's what they did. And I'll be honest, I was distraught when they were asking questions of me. Not so much because I was scared that I'd get the blame for the girl's death, but because I felt so terrible for her. The feeling sorry for myself only lasted a minute or two, then after that I broke for her. They didn't say how she'd been murdered, only that it was a murder. But I suppose from my reaction, they could tell that I wasn't the one who did it. I mean, I was just one of 3 girls who slept near the body that night, but for whatever reason, none of us were considered suspects. None of the guys staying in the hostel got arrested either, and since there were obviously no security cameras, there was no CCTV footage to identify who the girl had been hanging around with before she was killed. The police told us that we couldn't leave the hostel until they'd done some investigating, and us girls asked if there was anywhere else we could sleep. And the owner wouldn't let us sleep in the men's dorm with them, but the guys volunteered to sleep outside in the backyard so that we had somewhere to sleep that wasn't home to a corpse just hours before. A few days later, the police came back and said they'd arrested a suspect, so we were all free to leave Tangier if we wanted to. They wouldn't tell us anything more, only that we weren't suspects. The experience formed a little bond in the group that ended up staying in the hostels after the girl's body was found, and I ended up traveling down to Marrakesh with them. We had a really good time, especially in the daytime when we could do things to distract ourselves. But at night, while we were smoking and drinking, someone would inevitably bring up the girl's murder and things would obviously get quite dark. I still think about that girl sometimes, and being reminded of her through telling my grandkids about her had her on my mind for days and days on end. I told them so they'd know to be careful, so they'd know not everyone out there is just a friend that they haven't met yet. So, my name's Joel too, and in September of 1996, I was an 18-year-old gap year student living here in England. Most kids go into their gap year with a travel plan, but not only did I not have a plan, I really didn't have much money either. I knew that if I flew somewhere like South America, my money would go a lot further, and so initially, I was looking at places like Colombia, Peru, or even Chile, because it meant spending a few weeks somewhere exotic where the weather was nice and the food wasn't bad. But then, sometime in late November, I saw a news report about something called Visit Myanmar Year. Now, the BBC showed a big parade filing past some presidential-looking fella, but not a military one, and this was more like a cultural exhibit. Then the reporter talked all about how the country was opening itself up to visitors for the first time in years. It was this huge event, apparently, enough to warrant a few minutes on the nightly news, but all I found myself asking was, where the bloody hell is Myanmar? It turns out Myanmar is what Burma changed its name to in the 1980s. It was initially colonized by the British and then became a big battleground between us and the Japanese during World War II, and then after a brief period of democracy after independence, the country's army seized power. And then, after closing themselves off for about 30 years, they decided that they wanted a bit of tourism, hence Visit Myanmar Year. It was billed as this untouched paradise of white sandy beaches and lush green animal preserves. Only trouble was, it had a wildly authoritarian military dictatorship that did things like use political prisoners for slave labor. I heard Myanmar's government had built half a dozen brand new hotels using that same unpaid workforce, which gave rise to a counter-tourism campaign led by human rights campaigners called Don't Visit Myanmar Year. Now, it probably sounds horrible, and I'd never visit a place like that these days, but back then, all I was interested in was how far my money would stretch there, not to mention being one of the first tourists to visit the place in more than 3 decades. And so when I heard that I could live like a king for as little as a tenner a week, that was all I needed to hear. After a 17-hour journey, which included a short stopover in the Middle East, I landed in Yangon, formerly known as Rangoon. I didn't stay in one of those fancy slave-built hotels. Not even 5 stars of luxury could have swayed me into that one, I'm glad to say. But I did book myself into a nice little hostel near the city's Chinatown, which was priced at a head-spinning 80 pence a night. The British influence on the place is quite evident in a lot of the architecture, but Yangon also had some of the most incredible Buddhist temples I've ever seen, and the city's pagodas were something else entirely. Imagine a huge spire, almost 400 feet tall, and it's quite literally covered in solid gold plating. Then imagine how it shines in the midday sun in Southeast Asia when temperatures are touching 40 degrees in the shade. Needless to say, the Shwedagon Pagoda is one of the most incredible things I've ever seen, and since I was one of the first waves of tourism to hit Myanmar since it opened, I got a lot of stares. I didn't mind. In fact, I sort of knew that was going to be the case, so it wasn't a surprise either. Then after a day of walking around Yangon, trying out different foods and practicing my Burmese from the phrase book I'd bought, I made my way back to the hostel. It was a narrow side street, and it looked quite rough from the outside. But on the inside, past these two rickety wooden doors, it was actually really nice. The hostel's owner and operator, a guy called Min, was very proud of the place, and his wife helped do the cooking, his daughter helped with the cleaning and the laundry, and that was how they made their money. Min's English was really good, and he made me laugh when he quite deftly described his hostel as unassuming. And that was exactly the word for it, unassuming, because when he showed me up to my room, it was so much nicer than I expected. The place was spotless, the bed was small but comfy and clean, and while the toilets and showers were communal on each floor, there was no one else staying on mine, so I had a section all to myself. And by about day 3, I figured that I made the best choice of travel destination possible, not just because the weather was lovely and the food was so good, but because the place was just so weird. It had been isolated for 30 years, and Myanmar still didn't properly open itself up until about 2011, so when I was there, it was almost like going to North Korea or something like that today, with the place having developed its own little microculture. Going to temples and all of that was fun, but it was a buzz just meandering around and soaking the place up, too. At night, I'd open up the windows of my room and then work my way through a bottle of beer or two, smoking cigarettes and just sort of listening to the city hum. But that's how I noticed how, late at night, Min would walk people through the hostel, out into the backyard, and into what looked like a small storage shed. And from my perspective, it didn't look like anyone ever came out again. I say shed, it was made of concrete and had this big iron door with one of those letterbox-style peepholes on it, but the structure itself couldn't have been any bigger than a garden shed. Min would walk them up, chatting like he was old friends with whoever he was with. He'd knock on the door, the peephole would slide open, and then so would the door once the guard or whoever was happy everything was cool. Now I reckon that there must have been some stairs heading down into a basement or something, because one night, Min took around 20 to 30 people out to the small concrete structure, enough to make me think that there was almost maybe a party going on down there. Then, the night before I decided to ask him about it, Min had caught me watching him from the window at about 1:30 in the morning. He stopped, gave me a sort of blank stare, and then just carried on walking. Now, the following afternoon, Min was at reception when I returned from lunch. Now, he gave me this playful look as I approached him and then said something about how I was doing a bit of spying that previous night. He wasn't confrontational about it, so I confessed that, yes, I had been a bit curious about what was going on in the back. Min said he hosted gambling nights down there. Nothing too extravagant, just a few games of cards played among friends for some pocket change. But then, being the curious soul that I was, I asked if I could join him one night for a few hands of whatever they were playing. Min laughed and said that while he understood my sense of adventure, he didn't care to mix business and friendship, especially not when there was money on the line. But I wouldn't hear it. I very crassly proposed that I buy my way into the casino, but Min wouldn't hear it either. And in the politest way possible, he insisted that I stop asking because the last thing he wanted was for me and him to have a fallout. Now, I took it on the chin. He'd been a great host and his wife's cooking was phenomenal, so the last thing I wanted to do was disrespect him. But then over the next few days, my curiosity grew and grew, until after the incident with the crying man, I could no longer help myself. I was doing my window watching routine one night when, at one point, the door of the concrete shack opens up and Min steps out with a guy who was crying. Min was silent and the crying guy was doing all the talking around his sobs, staring off in whispers at first, but then getting louder and louder until Min barked something at him and the man went quiet. Min then took what looked like a big roll of money out of his pocket, peeled a few off, and then stuffed them in the man's shirt pocket. But the crying man didn't seem interested. He just kept whimpering things to Min in Burmese. Now, watching on, I thought the crying man had lost all of his money or something like that, and that the backyard casino had way higher stakes than just a bit of pocket change. It might sound mental to anyone older than 25 because it most certainly sounds mental to 47-year-old me these days, but I just had to know what was behind that door. I mean, what was really behind that door. It took a couple of days for that blister of curiosity to really fester away in me, but when it reached bursting point, I went to one of only 2 banks in the whole of Myanmar that allowed access to international bank accounts. There, I withdrew exactly 1 million kyat, which I think was about 50 to 60 quid back then, give or take. And the teller gave me some really funny look as she counted out the cash, but I didn't care. My only concern was thinking of something I could occupy myself with for the next few hours until the sun went down and the night drew in, and Min started welcoming his friends down into that shady basement-looking place. Because when he did, I was going to knock on the door, ask to speak to him, and then offer him a cool million to let me in. I had this idea in my head that it'd be some wild Asian gambling den, with fellows smoking opium in one corner and playing ancient and indecipherable games of chance in another. And after seeing the shiny, happy side of Yangon for 10 days straight, I was ready to see its underbelly in the final few days I had left there. And so, around 1 in the morning, just like clockwork, Min started walking people out towards the concrete shed. I waited until he walked about 24 people through the yard, and then after chugging half a bottle of beer for some Dutch courage, I made my way downstairs and out into the yard. My heart was going a mile a minute by the time I knocked on the door. The letterbox-shaped peephole slid open, and an angry-looking pair of brown eyes appeared before their owner barked something in Burmese at me. I just asked, "Min?" a few times, hoping he'd understand, but all the guy did was slide the peephole closed again. Now I was left standing there, money in my hand, thinking, they're not just gonna let me in, are they? And I also reckoned Min might get so annoyed that he'd threaten to kick me out of the hostel. But the idiot teenager in me thought that it'd be a good idea to try knocking again, and I thought if Min won't come to the door, then I'd try bribing the doorman. But then no sooner had I knocked, it swung right open, and I was faced with a very angry-looking Min. Now, it was very frightening to be honest, seeing this kindly Burmese bloke suddenly turn on me, and I honestly had no idea what to say, and so I did the only thing I could think of, held out the wad of cash, and told him he could have it if he'd let me into the casino. I honestly thought it was the money that had changed his mind, but when he finally did relent, he told me to put my money away and save it for betting. I was elated, but then Min suddenly threatened me with what he'd do if I didn't stay quiet about what I saw. He said if I went to the police to talk about what I'd seen down there, he'd arrange for them to find some pills in my luggage. He didn't specify what kind of pills, but he didn't have to. I knew what he was getting at. If I grassed him up, he'd have to punish me. But if gambling wasn't completely restricted in Myanmar and Min's little backyard casino wasn't illegal since he wasn't profiting from it, then what the hell was he threatening me for? I didn't dwell on that though, I couldn't. Min was standing right in front of me waiting for an answer. And I told him that I accepted his conditions and that I wouldn't breathe a word of what I'd seen. I neglected to mention that I intended on telling everyone once I got back home because of course, I was going to regale them with the tales of my adventures. I just wouldn't say anything to the Burmese police. But then, in what I consider to be a very delicious twist of irony, it was years before I was able to talk to anyone about what I saw that night. Min gave me this look, like he was weighing up his options and weighing me up a bit too, and then after telling me to follow him, we walked past that big iron door together and down a long flight of winding stairs. I stayed close behind Min, with the guard giving me all kinds of funny looks as I passed him. We walked down steps for what felt like a couple of minutes before the stairs stopped and we were faced with another corridor. At the end of it was another thick door, and from behind it, I could hear muffled sounds of shouting and commotion. Min turned to me before he opened and asked if I was sure I wanted to enter, and while it seemed so bizarre to me looking back on it all these years, there wasn't anything I wanted more. When I said yes, I thought he might give me a smile of approval or something, but he didn't. He kept this steely look on his face and then turned and cranked the handle of the big iron door. The second Min pulled it open, I realized that it must have been soundproofed or something because I was hit with what I can only describe as a wave of sound. I'd seen Min welcome about 24 people into the shed, but down in the actual basement, there must have been more than 100 people, all surrounding what looked to be a dog-fighting ring. I realized that there must have been multiple entrances too, and that Min's was just one of a network of entrances that led down into a space the size of maybe a secondary school gymnasium. But before I could really take in what I was seeing, Min told me to follow him again. As we weaved through the crowd, it was like every single person turned to look at me. They were positively flabbergasted to see a foreigner in their midst, and I can't say I blame them. I imagine I looked pretty shocked too, especially when I looked down into the little ring in the center and saw a guy hosing what looked like blood into a sewer grate. I couldn't stare for long. I had to keep an eye on Min in front of me as he took us towards a collection of bookmakers. I was convinced I was about to witness either a cockfight or a dogfight. Now imagine my surprise when two young Burmese men were led into the pit, one with a white headband and one with a black headband. Min smiled for the first time and shouted, just in time, to be heard over the noise of the crowd. Some of them rushed to the edge of the pit, staring intently at each man, and then a veritable frenzy of betting kicked off next to us. And then once the crowd thinned out a bit, Min asked who I wanted to bet on, black headband or white headband. I told him it was hard to place a bet without knowing what they were about to do, but Min told me it didn't matter. They were about to play a game of chance, not a game of skill or test of strength, and while some gamblers claimed that they could see the winner before the game was even played, Min assured me that that was nonsense. As I handed Min 10,000 kyat, I asked him which contestant he recommended, and without a beat, he said black headband. Then as I watched him hand the money over to the bookmaker and I placed my bet, I started to be reminded of a film I'd watched some time before, a little film called The Deer Hunter. I remember watching the film thinking, no way does that actually happen, and I had a similar thought in that big, loud basement. I asked Min the name of the game that they'd be playing, and I hoped that he'd name some sort of local blood sport. But when he turned to me, raising his voice again to be heard over the crowd, he confirmed my deepest, darkest fears when he said, Russian roulette. I was stunned. I mean, absolutely gobsmacked. But I made a right tit of myself because all I could think to say to Min was, this is just like The Deer Hunter. Obviously, Min hadn't seen that movie. He hadn't even heard of it, and so he gave me this funny look and asked me to repeat myself. I told him it didn't matter, and looking back on it, I think that was some attempt to disassociate from what was actually happening. And then, when everything went down, that it was all actually real, I realized what a huge mistake I'd made. I didn't want to see anyone get their head blown off in front of me, but at the same time I knew that turning to Min and immediately saying, I want to leave, would only make him furious. He'd warned me on multiple occasions not to get involved, so instead of making even more of an idiot of myself, I kept my mouth shut and watched the game unfold. I thought the organizers might go grab each man a chair and a table to put between them, but they didn't. I mean, why would they? It wasn't a movie that didn't need to conceal tubes that made blood squirt out of Christopher Walken's head. The only kind of theatrical thing that happened was when the, I suppose you might call him referee, walked around the edge of the pit, showing everyone how the bullets in the gun weren't fakes or anything. He walked slowly, shouting something in Burmese every so often, and then once he'd completed the full loop, the two contestants stepped face to face with one another. The referee shouted something, and then everyone went quiet. He then flipped a coin, before presumably asking one of the contestants heads or tails. They answered, the ref checked the coin, and then after a word from the contestant, the ref handed the revolver to his opposite number, meaning the man in the black headband would pull the trigger first. It was easily the most surreal and frightening experiences of my entire life, thinking to myself, this can't be happening, while my inner monologue screamed, but it is. and you need to leave right now. But I couldn't. I'd made my bed and now I had to sleep in it. The referee put one bullet in the revolver, and after spinning the cylinder around and around, he slammed it shut and handed it to Black Headband. And then the whole place went from raucous to silence in the time that it took for the young man to raise the gun. I could see him shaking, and then after scrunching his eyes closed, he pulled the trigger. Yet nothing but a dull click was heard. The room erupted, with people cheering or shouting, and men explained how all kinds of bets were made on when or who or if. But the rules were that each man took 5 shots and the cylinder was spun before each and every one. If someone died, they died, but more often than not, they didn't. It wasn't like fictional depictions of Russian roulette I've seen where someone's demise seems like the absolute goal. The crowd were just gambling, albeit in a very high-stakes environment, and the contestants stood to gain a lot too. They could bet on their own survival or their opponent's death. Some even bet on themselves to die, as it meant their family got a bit of money if they did. But I've also no doubt that there were people there who wanted to see someone get their head blown off, and I think Min was one of them. When the man in the white headband put the revolver to his head, the room went quiet again, and then after a second dull click, the cycle repeated itself. The room went crazy, the revolver's cylinder was spun, and then it was handed back to the man with the black headband, but once again, pulling the trigger yielded nothing but a dull click. I actually started to relax a little bit as each man completed his 4th trigger pull without a shot. I'd once been convinced I was about to watch someone die, but just like Min said, it seemed like it was actually kind of a rare event that someone was killed playing with just 1 bullet. It was still horrifying to witness those guys doing what they were doing. I just didn't feel like I wanted to run anymore. But then, as the man in the black headband was due to take his final shot, it looked like he was hesitating. Both contestants were shaking pretty heavily by trigger pulls 4 and 5, but Black Headband was shaking like a leaf by his 5th attempt. Now I thought he was psyching himself up to finish the game, but after shaking and scrunching his eyes closed just like he did the first time, his hand dropped away from the side of his head, and he whined something in Burmese that could have been, "I can't." And the crowd went ballistic, not with cheers this time, but with anger. And as the referee began shouting something at Black Headband, 2 bigger guys, who were obviously security of some kind, jumped into the pit to join them. Black Headband put the gun to his temple again, but again he failed to pull the trigger. I started wondering what might happen in this sort of situation, but was quickly provided an answer. The 2 security guards rushed Black Headband, pinning him to the concrete floor. I thought he might try and shoot them as they rushed him, but he didn't. He just dropped the gun and then backed up with his hands raised like he was pleading with them. Seconds later, he was pinned, and then they held him there while the referee picked up the gun. The ref shouted something at the crowd, who immediately fell silent, and then he put the revolver right against Black Headband's forehead and pulled the trigger. But once again, there was nothing but a dull click. The crowd burst into cheers and laughter that Black Headband had been scared of an empty chamber. Even White Headband was laughing, and he stayed laughing as the referee spun the revolver cylinder one final time before handing it to him. Black Headband was lying on the floor in a puddle of shame, quite literally too, since he actually peed his pants around the time the referee put the gun to his head. Then, White Headband raised the gun, and the crowd fell silent again. He was still chuckling at Black Headband as he pulled the trigger. Then bang! His skull all but disintegrated. If you think the crowd might have reacted any differently than before, with any bloodthirst for example, they didn't. White Headband's head exploding was nothing more than something that won or lost them money. Some cursed, others cheered and waved their betting slips in the air. But me, all I could do was stand there, staring at what remained of White Headband's head until Finally, I heard Min in my ear saying, "Congratulations, you won." And that was the second time I saw him smile, when realizing I'd made a terrible mistake, as it was written all over my face. He told me to follow him so I could collect my winnings, and then once I'd shoved that big bundle of blood money into my pocket, Min was still smiling as he asked me, "Have you seen enough?" When we were outside again, walking back across the yard, Min reminded me of what had happened if I told people what I'd seen. Not in a rude or overly intimidating way, he just asked if I remembered our arrangement regarding discretion. And when I said yes, he didn't say anything else until we parted ways. He wished me a good night, but I was in no mood to sleep. Instead, I went out drinking, and I ended up giving away that blood money in pieces to a series of beggars I encountered, and I drank until I could only stagger and then almost got myself arrested when I tried to sleep on the steps of a temple I found myself at. The police drove me back to the hostel, and thankfully the reception was deserted, and then I staggered up to my room and crashed out on the bed. The next morning's hangover was abominable, and it wasn't until about lunchtime that I stopped vomiting and was able to keep water down. I wanted to pretend the whole thing had never happened, and apparently Min was only too happy to oblige me, because when I finally trudged downstairs to get some of the in-house food, Min was just as warm and cheerful as ever. I ate in silence, and then went back up to my room to sleep off the rest of my hangover. And then in the evening, I went to a Buddhist temple and stayed there until late at night. Now, I won't get into everything I meditated over. I'm sure you can all probably guess the kinds of things that I was thinking about, but I'll just say that I realized for the first time in my life just how full of darkness and horror the world really is, and how sheltered I'd been from growing up in the leafy green suburbs of England. My name's Devin, I'm from Ohio, and I think you could probably shoehorn this story into a video of yours because it's easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. So back in 1999, I decided to do a little traveling before college. The Philippines was beautiful, Vietnam was awesome, and Malaysia turned out to have some of the best food I've ever tried. But it was in Thailand that I got a tip from a fellow backpacker, and that tip was to head to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is this little island off the coast of India, and while it has many of the same flavors as its much larger cousin, it got a very different feel, at least out on the coast it does. The capital, it's called Colombo, and it's sort of like a big human filing cabinet in places. Definitely not my scene, but the little coastal towns were almost like paradise. It was all sun, sea, and surf, and then after deciding it was good enough of a place to spend a week or so, I checked into this little beachside hostel, and that's where I met Mika. Mika was from Finland, and Mika was crazy. Fortunately, I mean that in the best possible way, as in he was probably the most fun-loving, party-going person I had met on all my Asian travels. He was the one who showed me all over Hikkaduwa and like where the best food was and where the beer was cheapest and coldest. And he also showed me a place that did some really good iced coffee, something I think I might have lost my entire mind without. He also showed me a place that did good iced coffee, something I think I might have lost my entire mind without. And he also showed me where all the surfer girls liked to party once the sun went down. Now, one morning after waking up, we decided to blast away the cobwebs with a local hangover cure of eggs, and more eggs with a huge side of red chili sauce. And then when we got back to the hostel, there was someone in our room. The hotel was divided up into maybe 5 different communal rooms, and each one had 3 beds. I met Mika because we were sharing a room, and the 3rd bed had been empty, but when we got back from breakfast, someone had taken it. We had to wait a minute before they returned from using the communal showers, and when they did, a giant walked through the doors to, well, I was going to say greet us, but he didn't. This huge, fat-as-hell red-headed dude walked in wearing nothing but a towel and some flip-flops, and he then gave us some blank stare and then started unpacking the rest of his stuff from some roller case. Mika was the first to say, "Hey man, how's it going?" But he did the same thing. He just sort of looked up, gave us both a blank stare, and then went right back to unpacking in a way that wasn't just rude, it was weird. I gave Mika this sort of look when the fat guy's back was turned, as if to say, what the hell is this guy's problem? But then, after a moment it would look like deep thought, Mika asked the guy, "Ruski?" Only then did the guy speak and say, "Da, Ruski," in reply. It turns out the guy was Russian, and since Finland and Russia share a border, Mika knew enough Russian to explain that he spoke a little before asking the guy's name. I mean, I didn't understand what was being said. I just saw that the guy got very defensive before Mika raised his hands as if to say, "Okay, I'll stop." It turns out when he asked the Russian guy his name, he replied with the Russian equivalent of "none of your business." And then Mika basically asked him what his problem was, and the guy told him to back off, and so Mika did, and then recommended we leave. He filled me in as we walked along the beach towards a bar we like to hang out at, and then he laid out our options over some beers. And by that I mean what to do about that Russian guy, since he was clearly probably going to be a problem. Mika said if he was a total a-hole, we could just pack up and move hostels. We'd lose out on the days that we'd already paid for, but everywhere was so cheap that it kinda didn't matter if we just pitched up someplace else. But then Mika also said that since the guy was Russian, there was like a 50% chance that he'd end up being chill as hell once he was drunk and figured out that we didn't actually hate Russians. Now, we figured stay one more night, see if he's cool, and if not, then we'd move on. And then we kept on drinking on the beach till the sun had set and it was time for the real party to start. Now, to cut a long story short, we met up with some British girls, who obviously drank like sailors, and then since both me and Mika ended up hitting it off with the two of them, he slipped away to his girl's hotel room after wishing me some good luck. Now, my girl and I can't go to her friend's place because they shared a hotel room, so I invited her back to my hostel hoping that the Russian guy wasn't there. But then right as we're trying to get a tuk-tuk, which is kind of like a motorized rickshaw, the British girl starts projectile vomiting into the street. So not to sound mean, but I knew it was a write-off. And so instead of bringing her back to the hostel, I bought a few bottles of water from a nearby store, both for her to drink and to rinse the vomit a little, and then joined her in the tuk-tuk back to our hotel so I could make sure that she got home safe. It was the right thing to do, so that was cool, I suppose, but the real bonus was knowing that Mika's alone time with his British girl was about to get interrupted. It was a nice night for a walk, so I saved a little money by walking the mile or so back to my hostel. But then instead of taking the road, which got kind of sketchy at night, I walked on the beach. The night sky is incredible out there, another reason why I chose to walk instead, but then maybe about halfway through my walk, I see these two Sri Lankan guys standing on either side of someone sitting on some lounge chair, and even from a distance I could tell it was the red-headed Russian. The Sri Lankan guys were standing, but the Russian was almost as tall as them sitting down, like he was this huge lump just sitting there silent while the Sri Lankans were talking among themselves. Now, I'm in a pretty good mood, right? So I see the Russian guy and I say, "Hey, buddy, how's it going?" And then I ask the two Sri Lankans what's going on. They explained that they'd closed their bar for the night, and when they tried to get the Russian to leave, he ended up sitting his butt down on one of their loungers. The same lounge chair that they needed to clean and stack before they could get home for the night. The Russian guy was already a big proponent of blank stares and few words, but when I looked at him, he looked near blackout drunk. His face was all red, eyes bloodshot, kind of panting too, like one of those fat English bulldogs. I remember what Mika said about him maybe being cool, so I took it upon myself to do those Sri Lankan guys a favor by moving him on while befriending him in the process. I tried almost everything except physically pushing him off that lounge chair. But you know what worked in the end? Saying the word vodka to him. His eyes lit up, and then after repeating the word back to me, he hauled himself to his feet and we were on the move. The Sri Lankan guys were very grateful and were yelling "thank you, good night" as we walked off. Then, being drunk out of my mind, I started just yapping at the Russian guy in a language he couldn't understand just for fun of it. Now I remember saying, "What's your deal, dude? I bet your parents made you wrestle bears in the circus, 'cause you're built like a freaking tank, aren't you?" Now, he didn't say anything in reply. He didn't even look at me. He just kept staggering along the beach at my side as I kept on yapping away. We walked for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then the hostel we were staying at came into view. But when the Russian realized that I hadn't taken him towards vodka, he got mad. He turned and then started staggering towards me, saying something in Russian. I told him to chill, that we could get some drinks another time, but nothing stopped him. I didn't think he'd do anything, so when he did, I reacted way too slowly and ended up basically wrestling with a dude who was easily 30 to 40% larger than me. And as you can imagine, that didn't go well. He quickly overpowers me, puts me in a headlock, and then starts smashing the top of my skull with his fist. And his punches hurt like a mother effer, and all the while I'm yelling at him to stop and get off of me, but all he does is keep pounding. I was able to slip out of the headlock with a lot of struggling once he'd tired himself out a little, but I was so drunk that when I did, I immediately fell on my ass again, and when I did, that Russian guy was on top of me with his hands around my neck. I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of terror for as long as I live. The one I felt when I realized that this wasn't some drunken scuffle anymore, and that if I didn't get his hands off me, I was probably going to die. I tried pulling his hands away by the wrists, but that was no good, and then I tried throwing punches up at him, but nothing that landed seemed to have any effect on him. I kept punching and punching, trying and failing to fill my lungs, and then when they started to burn, I thought, Jesus Christ, man, this is it. This is how I die. I remember trying one last thing where I reach up and started trying to gouge his eye, but still, this Russian guy didn't let go of me. But then just as I was starting to get weak and feel my head start to spin, I heard this voice shouting, "Oi!" and this human missile flies in on the Russian and knocks him square off me. I was still rolling around in the sand, trying to catch my breath, as this voice in some heavily Australian English started yelling, "What's wrong with you, you dog?" And then when I rolled over, I saw 2 of his friends join in, and all 3 of them were built like football players. And one of them starts asking me, "Are you alright, mate? Look like a nasty bit of business. Are you 2 mates or what?" I could barely get a word out, but I managed to rasp out a no, as 2 of the Aussies proceeded to pin this Russian to the sand by sitting on him, while the third said he'd go and get the police. I asked if I shouldn't hang around so I could tell the cops what had happened, but they said that they'd sort it, in their words, and then told me to get myself home and showered to get the sand off me. That's when I realized how covered in it I was. How there was sand in my hair, in my mouth, even my nostrils too, and to this day I have next to no idea how it all had gotten there. Now, I have no idea what happened to that Russian, if he was arrested, charged, or deported or anything like that, because after telling Mika one hell of a story when he got back later that night, we ended up moving on down the coast the next afternoon. We just didn't want to risk it, you know. There had been enough bad vibes already, so why risk even more of the off chance the Russian managed to skirt his way out of trouble? And the rest of my trip was fine. In fact, nothing like that has ever happened to me since, but even now I still think about what might have happened if those 3 Aussies didn't show up for me, and I'm just as grateful for them today as I was when they first showed up and saved my life.